Hello and welcome to the RD2B podcast, a podcast for future nutrition professionals by future nutrition professionals. We are Teresa,
Neha,
Monica,
Natalie,
Michelle.
I'm Taryn.
And in today's episode, we will be discussing a topic that is very interesting because we're going to take a deeper look at sustainability, which might not be the first thing people think of when it comes to food and nutrition, but it's actually a very important part of the competencies that are required of dietitians.
totally, especially nutrition care, because we should be able to provide tips on how to reduce food waste. But how do we do this if we aren't aware of where food waste occurs within the food system?
Yeah, I think often when we think of food waste, what immediately comes to mind is what gets thrown away after you're done eating a meal or those we call leftovers in the back of your fridge. But there's actually a lot more to it than that.
Yes, and I think before we go any further, it's important to distinguish between food loss versus food waste. Waste occurs at the retail and consumption level, so like when food can no longer be sold because it's past the expiration date, while loss occurs at earlier points of the supply chain, such as production, processing, and distribution, for reasons like poor forecasting and overproduction.
You know what isn't talked about much? Our own expectations as consumers. Our desire for what's aesthetically pleasing. That plays such a vital role in food loss.
Yeah, we definitely have expectations for what our food should look like. And today we're going to explore where these expectations come from and how they play a role in the avoidable losses of produce in the food system.
So food loss is either avoidable, food that's totally edible but thrown away, like food that's left to go bad, or unavoidable, which are non-edible food parts like banana peels.
Did you know along the entire Canadian food supply chain, 35.5 million tons of food is thrown away, of which at least 32% of the losses are totally avoidable.
Wow.
Yeah, and it starts right at the beginning. Processing and production stages of the supply chain are the greatest contributors of food loss, respectively contributing 34% and 24% of total food loss.
Yeah, food loss is bad for obvious reasons. How could we be wasting all this food when so many people are hungry or malnourished? But also, think about the costs incurred from all the inputs wasted in producing, processing, and distributing the food to the costs associated with disposing of the food in landfills.
So true, but I'm thinking about the impact on the environment. Modern agriculture is not sustainable, with its intensive use of non-renewable and renewable resources. I mean, in 2018 alone, Canadian farmers used 2.95 trillion liters of water for irrigation.
Right. So basically, when food is lost along the supply chain, then all of these embodied resources are also lost or wasted. Did you know in 2015, 30 megatons of greenhouse gases were generated from food being disposed of in Canadian landfills?
That's nuts.
I think it's easy to dismiss the impact of food loss on the environment when we don't see the consequences firsthand. Like as someone who lives in Toronto, soil degradation is a faraway thought.
The thing is, people are being directly affected by these repercussions, especially communities on the periphery of society, like people of color.
Wait, how?
Well, these communities are disproportionately located in areas of greater exposure to pollutants from neighboring facilities, like fertilizer plants. Usually, land is sold for much less in these rural areas, driving these industries to take root.
Oh, so basically, the health of these communities, which is already compromised from systemic inequities, is being further compromised by exposure to environmental hazards.
Man, that's heartbreaking, especially because a lot of this is so avoidable. Makes you think, what is driving all of this loss in the first place?
Well, we're biased towards beauty. A major reason for food loss is aesthetics.
All right, well, let's talk about beauty bias. We all have it, right? And it's based on food safety standards, isn't it?
Yeah, to an extent. There are psychological and biological reasons as well, but the food standards definitely do lay a foundation for our biases. And we'll come back to those standards in a bit.
Yeah, so psychologically, we've created these idealized prototypes in our head, like reference points. The thing is, these prototypes skew our expectations of how fruits and vegetables should look.
Yeah, it's funny. Like when I'm growing my own vegetables, I don't care about the colors, I don't care about the shapes, as long as something grows. But I notice that when I'm grocery shopping, I have this like implicit preference for, let's say, tomatoes that are firm and the perfect shade of red.
Apparently a lot of us wouldn't buy imperfect looking produce, even if we had that option in store.
Right? Appearance is probably the biggest factor that influences how we shop. After all, we eat and shop with our eyes first. So, for example, when we're buying tomatoes, our minds will sort through the mental Rolodex of prototypes, and well, anything that doesn't compare to that perfect image is likely a no go.
All right, so this is the biological perspective. What we're talking about here is our disgust emotion kicking in. Now, disgust was thought to have originally evolved to protect us from eating poison and stuff. But it's one thing to see a bright red mushroom growing with white spots on it and think, yeah, I probably shouldn't eat that because it's probably poisonous. But then to see a tomato that's lumpy and think maybe there's something wrong with it, when really there probably isn't, that speaks to our expectations for perfection.
Yeah, and I think we need to be aware of what unsafe foods actually look like, especially because this isn't always going to align with their prototypes. And this is so important to be cognizant of, especially as RDs to be.
So, what's the difference between the produce we see in store and the other stuff that was deemed unsellable?
Okay, so this actually takes us back to the food standards. Health Canada and the Canadian Food Inspection Agency set up these standards and requirements that essentially dictate what can and cannot be sold in Canada. Fruits and vegetables are graded, just like eggs and beef, and there are specific requirements within each grade. And these rules are all super strict. A lot of the requirements were set for food safety purposes. So, for example, to sell apples, they must be free from insect larvae. And I'm pretty sure we're all okay with that. But the problem is that so many of the requirements pertain purely to cosmetic standards that have no value other than looks.
So basically, we're discriminating against food.
Yeah, it sounds nuts, right? If a tomato is, and I quote, kidney shaped, lopsided, elongated, or angular, it's typically trashed. But like, what's wrong with a lopsided tomato? Nothing.
So, I guess what we're saying here is that because of our biases, this food loss is our fault?
Well, these biases are embedded in our modern day food system. Us consumers, the CFIA's narrow quality standards, big retailers, we're all indirectly driving these avoidable losses.
And our preference for perfect looking produce keeps driving its demand. And in order to satisfy our demand, supermarkets, distributors, and even farmers continually perpetuate this bias. So, to compete with each other, to appeal to us consumers, they ramp up production to supply this perfect looking produce.
Which is then stocked in grocery stores and advertised in the media. We're constantly bombarded with images of perfect looking produce, which is all in line with our prototypes and just reinforcing these cosmetic standards and narrow scope as the norm. So there isn't really much out there that's changing our perception.
So, how exactly can we begin to tackle food loss within the supply chain?
Well, it all starts at the production stage. Farmers improperly forecast the demand for their crops, leading to an unwanted surplus.
But can't the surplus crops be donated to food programs?
Donations don't support farmers financially, and they're already struggling to make ends meet. Instead, Canada needs to invest in secondary markets that allow producers to sell surplus harvest or foods that are deemed second grade. For example, there's an app called Imperfect Produce in California that allows farmers to sell their surplus foods at a discounted price to regular folks, food service organizations, and even restaurants.
We need an app like that.
Well, even if producers had the economic means to donate, crop insurance stands in the way. Quality and size standards inhibit farmers from selling viable crops, while insurance claims prevent crop donations. The government needs to revise crop insurance policies to enable these donations.
Are there other ways farmers can get financial security?
Well, there needs to be a shift in negotiating power where more risk is equitably shared between farmers and markets. Contracts need to protect farmers from financial losses by increasing flexibility in production targets and accommodating labor requirements.
Wow, it's becoming clear that improving market structures and policies for farmers is critical in addressing food loss.
And expanding consumer mindsets would encourage farmers to harvest unaesthetic foods. If the demand for these foods increased, it would be more profitable for farmers to harvest them.
One tangible way we can shift consumer mindsets is by branding produce differently. In a 2021 study, UBC researchers found that labeling foods as ugly helped consumers become aware of their food biases.
Oh, yeah, I heard about that study. Using the term ugly signals to consumers that a deficiency in appearance doesn't always equate to a deficiency in food quality.
I also think grocery stores are great locations for dishing out education to the public. While shoppers purchase ugly, imperfect, whatever you want to call them, produce, they can simultaneously learn about the safety and nutritional value of these foods from the in-house RDs.
Wow, there are so many stakeholders to consider.
Yeah, consumers, for one, need to modify their preferences for produce aesthetics so that a chain reaction will follow to the production stage. Farmers, in turn, won't be pressured to sell food that conforms to a specific appearance.
Researchers, on the other hand, can continue to assess where and how much food loss occurs across the food system. This information would help create food loss targets in policy agendas.
And another important stakeholder is the government. They need to enforce less stringent grading regulations to enable hassle-free food donations and provide secondary markets to farmers.
Exactly. So I guess as a final thought, as a culture, we really need to change how we value food.
Yes, and like we talked about before, so much food is lost in ways that could be totally avoidable. Whether it's our psychological tendency to seek out prototypical produce, or our biological need to survive, or the lure of marketing, so much of this food loss is driven by our own demands for perfect looking produce.
Collaborative efforts by different stakeholders are required to modify the current practices that allow so much food to be lost in Canada to ensure food availability for future generations.
Yes, this issue requires a systems approach to fix. Issues need to be addressed at many different levels, from farm to fork to landfill and everything in between.
And for us consumers, well, we vote with our dollar. So the more we purchase this, quote, perfectly looking produce, the more grocery stores will make it available.
And by normalizing imperfect products, we can promote greater environmental health and put pressure on the industry to stop discarding safe and edible foods.
So today, we challenge you
And ourselves.
Take control of your food choices and change your perception of what fresh produce should look like.
Instead, explore different shapes, sizes, and colors.
Just as the Canadian Food Guide reminds us to be aware of marketing, we encourage you to be aware of how what you see in the media influences your purchasing decisions.
Yeah, totally. So that's all for today, and thank you all for joining us for this episode. See you next time on the RG2B podcast. Bye.
Bye.